Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. This is episode 68 of the Casual Stream. I'm once again joined by our resident Baudrillard expert, or more broadly, French existentialist expert, Mike of Pol. Now, how's your Death Athletics PhD going?
It's going well. My studies have slowed in recent days. I've taken on more projects. Specifically, I'm doing like a bunch of merch stuff just because I've got a bunch of productive capital. I've got laser engravers and stuff like that sitting around. So I'm actually working on some projects behind the scenes, doing merchandising for people. As lame as that is to say, that's not very post political or postmodern of me, but something I think that's going to be a cool value add for people in the coming months. So
Yeah.
um on the flip, oh, do you want to introduce the topic at hand by any chance?
Well, yeah. So I first heard about the term deterritorialization from Baudrillard in his Simulacra and Simulation, but it primarily goes back to two other French, I guess you could say, I don't know if Baudrillard could be considered Marxist, but these would have been considered Marxist critics of capitalism in the postmodern left, Gilles Deleuze and Felix Guattari, and they introduced the idea in the Anti-Oedipus, and they tie that into Sigmund Freud's idea of libido and polymorphous perversity and things like that. They expand on the idea a little bit. They say that generally speaking, with deterritorialization, there's also a re-territorialization to a new territory, but there's the sort of a stronger and weak form, where in the stronger form of deterritorialization, there is no reconstructed territory.
Right. So maybe we should zoom out a little bit because Deleuze and Guattari are actually their philosophy or their thoughts on philosophy is that um, philosophy is not the study and rigorous kind of like science of ideas. It is in fact just the creation of ideas and heuristics, right? It's not firm science. It's the creation of some of these new ideas, and that's a preoccupation of them of what bodies can do in spaces, as has kind of fallen out into modern verbiage, and it's a terrible phrase, but that's what they're chiefly concerned of is bodies and spaces, and what is these kind of new configurations of what people are able to do with some abstract ideas and lenses that get applied to different things, right? So they're chiefly concerned with that, right? They have a different view of what philosophy is in in just to start. That's kind of like a prima facie right there. So um territory, like deterritorialization, reterritorialization, it is a universally applied lens onto other concepts. So where did they get to that from like territory? So they start with a kind of anthropology, right? So where does territory come from? It's something that's more of a animal instinct. What do animals do to mark territory or to control territory? Scent markers, patrolling, or these sorts of things, these sorts of activities. These are kind of like a um the beginning of anthropology in this like kind of evolutionary sense, right? So their conception is that humans are the most territorial, or they have the most mastery over territorial spaces, right? And this is where they start to diverge and start to universally apply it, because territory in a geopolitical sense can be thought of, well, what would it mean for I don't know, Rome to have some of its land deterritorialized, right? So that would be like in combat, there is a battle, right? This is the process of deterritorializing, Roman territory, and then it's reterritorialized into, whoever else who is conquering some of these lands, like in during the fall of Rome, like easy example right there, right? So that is like the first level of like expansion onto, okay, well, this is into the plane of human interaction, right? So how can we take this a step higher in conceptualization in order to start thinking of it more universally. So the body, right? The body can be thought of as a territory. It's a whole amalgam of different component parts, but we see that and we say that a person's body is an entire unit. But what happens as you decide to reach out your hand to grab something, let's say a tool, right? So as your hand starts to reach out, it deterritorializes into a tool interface system, right? And then as soon as you grasp the tool, it reterritorializes into, and I apologize, we're going to say reterritorialization and deterritorialization like a bajillion times this stream, but there's no shorthand for it. D and re maybe. So it reterritorializes into a hammer swinging device, right? It separates and has a kind of like this idealistic platonic plane difference, a segmentation from the body, right? It is actually acting in a different capacity than it was as part of the complete unit of the body, right? And the same thing, and just to go back to what you were saying about, some of the pair case where you have things that are in flux where they will deterritorialize and reterritorialize like a hand. The other case where you have a permanent deterritorialization is something like the face, right? The face in all human expression is deterritorialized. It is in the state of flux of being in a motive device. It transmits emotions or reactions, and that is its kind of like pure purpose, right, is always being in the state of transforming into different things, but it never turns into, for this moment, it is a hammer swinging device, right? It is almost universally transformed into this state of flux.
So can I just interject real quick and see if I'm following you here? So if we just have a hand that's not in use, we could say that that's territorialized. As it's moving to grab the hammer, it's deterritorialized. And then when it grabs the hammer and uses it to do some work, it's now reterritorialized.
That is correct. Yes.
Okay. That's what I wanted to follow. Okay.
So to move on, so like then we have larger gaps, right? So how do we even take this to a higher level of arbitrary complexity? We can view various like sociological phenomenon as like territories and see how that same dynamic, that same flux, process of change happens in order to find a new configuration of a social dynamic, for instance. So a good example of this is let's say Haiti after independence was achieved, right? Um, the the they were territorialized as kind of a underclass, serving as like the underlings, like the Haitian people were serving as underlings and servants of a regime in a territory, right? The French, that was the regime, right? They have a new sociological paradigm that they were set in, right? And this was after a process of deterritorialization when the French colonial powers actually took over Haiti. So so you can see that this process of flux and change actually extends way back into history. But from then on, after Haitians had achieved independence, they actually adopted, with some amount of permanence, the same hierarchical structures that were put in place by the French, right? A lot of the slavery, sugarcane working, hierarchies never actually disappeared. So this process of deterritorialization into the new status quo did that there was actually like a false start, right? It was actually an incorporation of the hierarchy that was already formed during the last stage, whenever the French colonial powers took over, right? So we can see this with other sociological paradigms like for instance, maybe you could say the most liberalized of the Arab countries, right? So this could be, I would say, maybe the UAE, or maybe Saudi Arabia, right? The countries that have the closest ties to the West and have had the most sociological drift towards a more Western style of city, for instance, right? So the actual paradigm, sorry, the actual paradigm of how like cities are structured in the Arab world in some of the more richer countries actually is deterritorialized, right? It is something that underwent flux in the coming of the new century as bonds with the West actually got closer, especially economically. The way that their cities were even structured, that is not the way a city would be structured in isolation without exposure to some agent, some agonist that cause some amount of flux in order to change like some basic ideas about even city planning, right? They're still different, but they have deterritorialized as some of like these city planners or the way that I don't know the leaders and the different kings of these different Arab regimes as they have kind of internalized a more global style of thinking that the way that they thought that they would want to plan out a city changed to something that had more international appeal. So, think about Dubai, for instance. That is a very Western-ish city, right? It is metropolitan. It's very bougie. There's nothing but rich people. It's kind of like a paradise of rich people, right? This is something that is viewed more like the genesis of this idea was viewed more starting in the West, right? Or you can think of specifically France. France very much had an ideal in the past of a very bourgeois kind of ideas about the city and things like that. Is like, well, we can see that there's this kind of course of history how this flux in different social dynamics as things kind of like disappear, old regimes disappear, of thinking about even ordering cities and how that sort of city planning happens, right? That comes to influence other people, and this has been a tool of as Prudentialist has pointed out, like he has, I think, one of the best videos about this topic about deterritorialization and U.S. foreign policy. Um, this is actually a tactic that is used in order to kind of repress some of the subconscious differences and things that would actually cause a great amount of strife between two very different types of people in the world geopolitically, right? This has even become a tactic of USG.
Yes. So a couple things here. One, I did watch Prudential's video, which was very good. It reminds me of a 1997 article written by Ralph Peters called Constant Conflict about how American culture, soft power, is used to start culture wars in other countries so that they fall apart fighting each other internally rather than fighting the United States directly. So that's interesting that while he doesn't use the term deterritorialization, he's fully aware of the implications of this broad concept as a weapon of soft power. Now, before I move into my next point, I want to ask a point of clarification. So, if we look at the deterritorialization of our modern situation, the way I would look at it, right, is the American right, more broadly, and then more narrowly, the dissident right, would view that as a bad thing. And their attempt to go back to something real or organic or authentic, the territory that we left, they want to go back to something like that. Would you say that's a correct construction of that within a Guattarian framework?
I would say that's fairly correct, yes.
Okay, so the problem that I have, and partly why I wanted to talk to you about this, is with the dissident right, they are pursuing courses of action that will not return to the territory. They're going to continue to deterritorialize. So, for example, one of the most famous would be Minch's Moldbug and the cathedral, and the idea of the Dark Elves regaining control of the cathedral. A few months ago, for reasons of, my friend and I, who were going through Moldbug, had to end up quitting due to life issues. He couldn't really make it after a certain point. But one of the criticisms that I have more broadly is that this isn't a real authentic change. And so if you want to reterritorialize doesn't necessarily mean you return to the old territory.
No, it explicitly means that you change to a new configuration.
Okay. Right. Oh, there. Thank you. So in that case, a Moldbugian strategy would not return to the territory we left. It would reterritorialize in a trajectory that was already set in place by the liberal, to use the other term, techno-capital, by Nick Land. They already set this trend up with their broader liberal hegemony, and if you just hijack it here, you're not going to really move to a territory that you want. So that's
this is the reason why I brought up the Haitian example, where the energy, the potential for change, because of the deterritorialization of the French being gone, right? The exercise of the sphere of influence not being there anymore, right, led to further deterritorialization, right? It led to kind of a degrading of even the hierarchies that were left in place by the new Haitian elite that continued the sort of slave trade sharecropper type regime, right? So the way basically it turns out like wasted potential, right? And that's what I think is a pretty good critique of the Moldbug example, is like, oh, we're gonna have a return of, like, I don't know, name your favorite, capital P progressive president from the last century, because they actually knew how to use power, or, something like this. It doesn't actually move us to a different place of political potential. Like the potential for change in the political paradigm is actually wasted, right? You've actually screwed your opportunity for some amount of time.
Yes. The other criticism that I was actually thinking about as you were explaining this is, okay, one way that we can, so Prudentialist talks about soft power used by the United States as a form of deterritorialization. Now, of course, one obvious element of U.S. soft power is popular culture. I think Prudentialist even mentions Hollywood. So the sort of the meme sphere on the dissident right seeks to reterritorialize Hollywood products. But the problem is, again, the same criticism I'd level against Moldbug, I'd level against this. This is not an actual way to return to anything more meaningful. By absorbing and consuming these Hollywood products and reterritorializing them, you're not actually fighting the hegemony. You're actually, again, going back to the Haitian example, just accelerating the process.
Right. This is why I think at the first Shieldings conference, the last, I'm not going to spoil too much because you got to buy the book, shill post real quick. But the note that Charlemagne left off his keynote speech at the first Shielding conference was, well, the kind of obsession with, with like mid-century spurgery and historical analysis, and trying to, okay, Spanish Revolution, we got to think of this as a heuristic for kind of reorganizing our thoughts about who really has power, who has better organization, stuff like that. It's like, well, the thing that drops out of that is completely new. For like the Spanish Civil War being a great example, right? A true monarchy did not fall out of the Spanish Civil War. It actually resulted into it resulted in something new and different, right? The reign of Franco is characterized by almost none of the same things, but a lot of being of the DNA of the right, without being, like a true monarchy. So I think that, Charlemagne's point in that speech is especially poignant now, like especially when we're talking about reterritorialization, right? What is the new social and political paradigm that we're aiming to, you know, kind of have like a genesis of, right? Is there any way that we can kind of hasten a a new territory, a new type of social configuration that will give a political advantage to people who are against hegemony, right? I think that is a very, very good point, right? And I think that's kind of the heuristic that I've been drilling on is like, well, have we been thinking wrong about some of the praxeologies of, I don't know, like, hate to say it, but libertarianism, broadly, or even the more cryptic gray market libertarians who say, no, I'm going to avoid taxes no matter what. That is like my only praxis, right? This is not legal advice. However, is there a more interesting way that interacts with 2023 world that causes different things to change, like especially as we have like worst economic paradigms, like it's like if like 10% of people turned into like ultra gray market libertarians who worked under the table no matter what, would that cause interesting changes? Would that re-territorialize the political space in a way that wouldn't have before, wouldn't have changed the same way, let's say during the Ron Paul revolution? No, during the heights of the Ron Paul revolution, if everyone embraced like libertarian praxis, well, guess what? It resulted in the same wet fart, right? It was not it was not deterritorialized, right? The political paradigm was not set up for a change in potential, right? To go to a different configuration.
All right.
So that, oh, sorry.
No, go ahead. I thought you were done.
So that, or just to sum up my point, I think that um, we cannot look at things in the past always the same way, because like different praxeologies could have different political potential, and I think that is like another important part of the concept of deterritorialization and reterritorialization is like, well, in the broad schema of all possible human actions, is there something that at this particular point creates a change that's not replicable at another point, even with the same praxeology? It's a different conceptualization of political action, because you're worried about the here and now. It's semi tangent to being practical, if you will.
Okay, so I want to first do another recontextualization and then see if you agree with this, if this is a correct use of terminology. Broadly speaking, without getting into the two specific examples I already gave, I think a serious problem with the dissident right is that the territory, the old social order, whatever that happened to be, whether it was 1950s America or, Imperial Germany or, Stuart England, whatever, that territory has been deterritorialized by various processes. Let's call it Nick Land's techno capital. And it's being re-territorialized into something else. We don't know what that is. And part of the reason why we don't know is because of the accelerationism, again, that Nick Land talks about. Now, they think that they can then direct that to some sort of re-territorialized future that looks a lot like the territory we left. Problem, as you said, is that one, re-territorialization is something different than the territory you left. And two, all of their imaginations for how to achieve social change are within the hegemony of the current deterritorialization.
Yes, I would say that's correct. So the point of nuance as well is like, it does not mean like me especially, because I consider myself a postmodern rightist, hard rightist, right? It does not mean that the various residues, as Pareto would put it, are invalid, right? It does not mean that having at the core of your moral and political belief like certain truths, and I think truths are ultimately, outside of the postmodernist fallen world, like all the way up the great chain of being to the ultimate truth, capital T truth of God, right? There's ultimate truth in that kind of ordering in your mind. So you could have a political disposition towards rightism or even getting down to niche specifics like Catholic distributism or anything else, right? You can have a this sort of disposition to get to certain end goals for um, a social organization, but that does not that does not mean you can return to the past when it was closer to something like you want, right? So it doesn't mean that the political instinct is invalid, is my point.
No, sure. And I'm not saying the political instinct isn't valid. The criticism is that the scope of that political instinct is still limited by the current hegemony because it only defines itself as the hegemony's old enemies.
Yes, no, yes, and that is
And that's the
uh,
point.
that's kind of like I guess the 4D chess version of the 4D chess version of like regime like monopoly something that's banging around in my mind, and this is semi tangent right here, but Christopher Sandbach had a really excellent Twitter space yesterday night, and he was talking about kind of like monopolies of information and information cults, data cults, and he was talking about how and this kind of intersected with kind of my fascination, which is Baudrillard, where you can fall prey to a bunch of these sociological, influences of like data cults and stuff like that, and frame games essentially, where you can you can no longer see the forest through the trees, and that connected to Baudrillard with the subject, the your very human subjectivity actually is repressed under the kind of influence of data cults and monopolies of information. So the very framing of the regime in total can actually restrict how you think about political potential. Like to your point exactly, right? The framing that the regime may give you, where maybe it's allowed for if let's say the state had infinite potential to go full totalitarian, but they realize that the most practical use is actually to let dissidents congregate online and kind of yearn for 1950s America, and just kind of like have a circle jerk about that, right? That's actually um, a more efficient use of manipulation of or of political dissidents than actually doing Wacos and stuff like that, because they actually get real blowback from that. So yeah, I think that's exactly on your same point. The water that we swim in, kind of refractalizes our vision for the future, and it's good to think about why that process is happening and try to break out of it.
Right. So I think this is a natural segue to the next point. Now, if we look at what the sort of liberal techno-capital hegemony has done through the process of deterritorializing, there is so there, if current trends hold. Now, again, I'm a collapsitarian, so I believe there'll be energy limits to this. But assuming there weren't any energy limits, just for the sake of argument, I believe what they would want to do is a totally synthetic silicon transhumanist reality, right? The new territory is this completely dissolved and reassembled Frankenstein made out of silicon, like an android. Now, none of us want that, and so if on the right specifically, but I even think some on the left, think of like radical environmentalists and others who would not want that either. I think the real question is, let's say that we'll call that reterritorialization 1. That's a horrible future. I don't think anybody decent person wants that. Now, let's say whatever we want is reterritorialization 2. It's not the same as the territory because by definition, they're two different things. And in fact, we can't really go back to the territory we left. Hopefully, we can preserve some of the values and principles of that territory. So the really interesting question now, and you already hinted at this with like the gray market, how do we create a new process of deterritorialization that will deterritorialize the current hegemony to get us to say reterritorialize too?
And so this is my connection back to Baudrillard, because I think, ultimately, as far as theory goes, I think Baudrillard is the most like eminently inspiring for practical ideas. And that may sound wackadoodle, but if you've listened to any other of these streams, you'll kind of understand where I'm coming from. And I always go back to the Cody Wilson example, um, as well, is like enacting different uh, let business plans. Essentially, like a lot of the change that happens in the world is due to business plans, and that could be as evil as like some DEI conference for for investors or something like that, all the way down to a certain product being introduced to the market. Right, we live in this kind of techno ecstasy of objects world, right? And this is part of the point that Baudrillard brings up many times about the revenge of the object and the seeming new empowerment of objects as opposed to human subjects. So I think that interacting with a this kind of like a pseudo accelerationism, I think that some of these e-acts accounts on Twitter, I think a lot of them have a lot of interesting ideas on moving to a different paradigm because they actually move forward with reckless abandon, right? So the absolute totality of, I don't know, the blockchain future or something like that, which seems to be, because most of these people are tech bros, seems to be like a path forward that they will move forward into with reckless abandon, right? That, in my opinion, that is moving more towards reterritorialization one, right? So that is not something that I want, but I think um, things that ensure I don't know, free of the liberation of ideas. Like I do believe that, in this kind of like core essence of like First Amendment type, ideas, the free exchange of ideas actually is kind of like a core preservation of some of the continued flux that could keep us going into the future. So I think technology or supporting technologies that actually enable more, as Nick Land calls them, root arounds, right? That cause more of these structural fissions to become more decentralized to smaller communities, right? And a lot of this is like coming from this theory cell conversation that we're having about deterritorialization, but it comes back to reinforce the idea of parallelism, right? This is the way that I arrived as to parallelism projects, projects that enable more parallelism, accelerate parallelism. That is enables something that Radlib would call kind of like the medieval European anarchy state, where you can have something closer to the absolute kingly authority of like a town or burg, but among these different nodes of the network, there is anarchy. It's not rules based order. It is purely this kind of market interaction between these nodes of network in medieval Europe. That is something that I see as the most plausible reterritorialization, is a return to what Radlib theorizes as like the reason for the European miracle, right? The only time in history that human populations have both grown and increased in their total economic output, right? Uh, I think that is what I'm thinking. Return to technologies and new configuration of social configurations with technology, because we can't get rid of it. We can't go Uncle Ted mode. So embrace it and try to push it to reterritorialize in that direction.
Okay, but just first of all, isn't that what led to techno capital in the first place in the process of deterritorialization?
So yes and no, right? So I view techno capital as a force that has been a centralizing effort to uh to like capital for its own sake, right? So the social configuration that causes more splits, right? Causes a higher degree of filter bubbleization, not online, but in real life. That is something that it has an anti-capital effect. So I think this is slightly different. Like you can reach a point of decentralization where it is way more gray market, right? It is way more unordered in un I guess it's opaque. It's opaque to the systems of capital and price discovery and all of these things that capital as an anthropomorphic entity, right? Its desire, as Nick Land kind of outlines, of like capital being its own subject, it has its own desires. I think there is a path away from that because you can actually obfuscate, price discovery and the different sensory organs of capital, if that makes sense.
Yeah, well, let me push back a little bit here because I think the sort of okay. So first of all, the reason why the Middle Ages was decentralized at all was going back to the very beginning of this discussion, where you said that the Germanic tribes that conquered Rome reterritorialized it. Yeah, the territory was a centralized imperial system. It was deterritorialized by the Germanic invasions, and it was reterritorialized into a patchwork of independent city-states, bishoprics, kingdoms, merchant republics, etc., etc. Now, one of the common shared bonds that people had, I would argue, were more custom. Because, for example, we don't really see from say 476, the fall of the Western Roman Empire with the deposing of Augustus Romulus by Odoacer, to say the beginning of the Hanseatic League and the North Sea and the beginning of the Italian city-states. I mean, they predate, say, 1100, but around the First Crusade, Genoa and Venice become dominant trading powers in the Mediterranean. We don't have a whole lot of economic activity. In fact, one of the arguments, one interesting theory in a book entitled, was it Muhammad de Charlemagne? Gustave Henri, a Belgian historian, argues that the continuity of the ancient world was with trade routes. And he says you could find lapis lazuli, which was a rare luxury item found mostly in Central Asia, in England as late as the 6th century AD. But after the Islamic conquests, where they disrupt the trade routes, lapis lazuli no longer shows up in England. And so for that window, we don't see a whole lot of economic activity because we don't see that the trade goods that one would expect. What I think instead we see is custom. And of course, the problem here then is if we look at like Baudrillard, Guattari, and Deleuze and others, custom is eroded by commercial activity.
No, you're right. It, I don't know. It's just an instant. It's an intuition that I have that, well, you have to find a way to segment off people and their normal day-to-day activity. And what does normal day-to-day activity mean in the modern sense? What does the modern person do? He's an economic unit, right? So how do you actually force the hand of people who are 100% like their whole being is as economic units, right? They sell their labor for this wage or that wage, and most of it's not good, and then go home and like live this kind of like deracinated, suburban or worse studio apartment, living in poverty, eating ramen every night. Like, how do you actually cause that person's um everyday activity to actually diverge away from the thing that techno capital wants the most, because everyone else is kind of like had by the balls because everyone is just an economic unit. And this is why I'm a Baudrillardian, right? I think we are living in the post-apocalypse, whereas Deleuze and Guattari are maybe hypothesizing ways to save the human subject, right? I don't think that at all. I think this is why I'm a Baudrillardian. The human subject is not in peril. It's already dead, right? It's the people en masse are controlled and confined to a system of normal day-to-day activity that is actually antithetical to any human well-being or or prospering, right? I think you have to like start one step over the other, because I don't think that um a radical deterritorialization of this regime is necessarily possible without collapse. See this is where me and you are different, right? I don't think collapse is imminent, whereas you are a collapsitarian. So this is one point of contention that we may go back and forth on, because I think there is a stair step process to rediscovering the subject after it's been dead forever.
Right. So again, we don't need to get into the collapse division, but I will say this, right? So you're correct. Right now, man is Homo economicus, and with every single, we see that actually is the problem, right? Because let's go back to another. If you're like on Twitter or social media, or like watch more like TradCon, the TradCon elements of this movement on YouTube, they'll talk about how, well, people used to have children in the objective poverty of, say, the Middle Ages, or the objective poverty of antiquity. And it's like, we're so rich now, why don't they have children? Well, because these people were living in integrated community social units governed by custom, in which childcare was not a commodity. Childcare was a duty that everybody within that kinship clan network of custom had to do. So it didn't matter that we were all broke, because we were all bound by custom to do this. And so I think the way that we get out of this, and it's going to be a slow, arduous task, is rebuild these networks of custom where certain activities that have become commodities are now returned to a outside of the market space. It's still economic activity, but it's not governed by the market or market factors.
Right, and this is the point I think we're having the most synchronicity on, is that, well, the goal is to actually get more towards that end. So maybe the stair stepping, I'm thinking of is more along the lines of, well, you can't get deeper community unless you get under Dunbar's number. You have to actually you have to cause some sort of impetus for filter bubbleization, right? You have to increase this IRL containment of how many people you actually know, because then you can actually start forming new real connections again. Whereas, like, right now, we live in the ecstasy of communication. We live in the Twitter world where you can interact with, like, there's probably days where I interact with 600 different unique individuals that are not bots on Twitter, and I don't know them, right? That there's no way that I could ask like some of the people I interact with on Twitter to like, hey bro, here's this thing like I'm kind of working on, and I know you're an expert in this, or can you help me with this, or can you even help me in my shop because I just need a hand to hold something up while I put a screw in the wall. Like, that is not possible. So my idea is anything that increases segmentation of groups of people, not individuals, not deracination, but groups of people together, and causes them to, have more, group sympathy and fervor, for each other. Everyone else's oomphy in smaller, tighter knit communities. That's kind of my idea, and I think that I think that some amount of this like crypto bro kind of idea can lead to that. That was the only point I was making.
No, I mean, fair. I mean, there's going to be a series of steps that we have to transition through to get back to the what do you call it? Reterritorialized self.
Yes.
Yeah. And I agree. But what I'm saying is, I think the element to really focus on here is a restoration of, and again, this wouldn't be new for anybody in the DR, but a restoration of kinship groups, custom, and duty. So it's really hard for people in the modern age to realize this, but a large amount of economic activity that occurred in all of human history, specifically with regards to child rearing and caring, was not a commodity. It was something that was done by a kinship group based on custom and duty. And that's how you could be basically broke by world economic standards and still have 10 kids, because, you know, you didn't have to pay somebody to take care of them. And of course, the way it worked was you pay it forward, right? So your parents take care of you when you're an infant, but then when you grow up and they become dotards when they're old, you take care of them. And this loop just keeps going. And what ended up happening is that loop was broken sometime within the last 100 years. And now part of getting out of this is going to be to restore that loop. And now this is going to be related to this. No easy task, right? Yeah, I love it. You said reterritorializing the self. We'll call that reterritory too. The other thing is we're going to have at least a broad set of agreements on what that looks like. Which again, anybody in the DR knows that's like herding cats. It's not going to be easy, but finding at least a minimum common ground that we could all accept, across the religious spectrum, pagan, Christian, atheist, whatever, libertarian, everybody else, right? Because we all have to be at least moving in a similar direction.
Right. Well, I think you don't actually have to agree on the end goal, right? So you can your political instinct, right, for which way you want to reterritorialize to, either option 1 or option 2. Option 2 is what we want, right? Can look different in how you actually pursue that end goal, right? So, for instance, you could be a big fan of homeschooling, of making sure that your kids are, anytime you're not watching them, they're watched by someone you know and you can trust, right? And reinstituting this kind of like kinship network, right? So how do we do that for a person that is having a kid, I don't know, right now, right? Or who just had a kid, and their parents are part of a boomer truth regime, deracinated, individual liberty self, right? That's kind of their frame of mind, right? And they just want to see their grandkid as a treat, right? So you can't actually reinstitute, the 3-generation household, de facto, to, in pursuit of your goal to go to, oh, sorry, my freaking work phone, to go to reterritorialization stage, or option 2. So how do you actually institute that? Like the child rearing part that you're actually bringing up is like, okay, do you actually build like a homeschooling network? If not a homeschooling network, then a child care network, where you actually like really are close to these people and hang out. It's not the same as the trad vision of 1800s or 1400s or anywhere else in the past. This is a configuration of social interaction that would be nowhere in history, where it's a group of dudes who are all having like kids at the same time that all figure out this kind of child rearing situation. They form this kind of like new type of tribe, right? That's not really something that's historical, but it may be the best way to reconfigure our sights to aim to the second option.
Right. Yeah. So ultimately, okay, so that's a pretty narrow problem, right? Having children and raising children. But ultimately, what needs to happen between now and something like that is, you already mentioned Dunbar's number. People have to live together, right? We're kind of spread all over the country. We might see each other a couple times a year at events and conferences, which are all well and good for what they are. But that's not the same as constant interaction with people that are just like you, right? So Aristotle and the Nicomachean Ethics defines what it takes to be a friend, right? You have to live within walking distance of each other. You have to consume salt together, which is a euphemism for eating family meals. And you have to wish well for each other. So you each have to have some sort of affection for the other and express that affection. Now, you can't do that online. You can't do that long distance. Now, what needs to happen at some point, if change is seriously going to happen, is somebody just going to have to, buy some property, maybe as a part of an organization, maybe you incorporate, and then you start moving people there. and you start a Dunbar's number community. And you start, and then a lot of these other problems we can then start solving because you're going to see each other every day.
Right. And it doesn't have to be a Dunbar's number city. It could be, I don't know, you could mimic, I don't know, the type of community building projects that, I don't know, the Mormon church does, because they've got, interesting kind of like housing and family arrangement, they've got interesting configurations for managing like the people that are in their church, or so that you could imitate like any style of organization. It doesn't have to be fixated on Dunbar's number or some other configuration. It actually, there's a large plane of possibilities for how you could organize this project, right? It's open for you to decide, right? And I think that's kind of the point of Deleuze when, going back to how we originally started this, like the absolute amount of configurations that are possible, and actually creating something new, right, by picking something out of that range of possibilities, right, is kind of like their concern with praxeology, right? How do you actually make something new? Is something that a lot of people actually note is like a lot of what Deleuze and Guattari are about, the synthesis of new. And so, then again, we're kind of like just lambasting this point of like, we can't just be obsessed with like 1950s America or any other generation in time as like the ultimate end goal and answer, because we are in a state of constant deracination, of deterritorialization, right? It is the modus operandi of politics, of economy, of the system, of the cathedral, right? So you have to actually pick a new thing, a new state of stasis that you want to land on, right? And it could take a lot of different forms. And so a lot of these political potentials, I think, are interesting because we can kind of decide, like, you can either look at the collapse and the decline of competence in managing infrastructure as like, oh my gosh, we're all doomed, we're all going to die, or you could look at it as an opportunity.
Right. So I'll just say two things with regards to that. Well, it is true that right in the theory cell stage we can talk about a lot of possibilities. The what I'm trying to get at though is there are going to be hard limits in implementing possibilities. Now, whichever course you take, a more optimistic course that techno capital will continue on as it is, or that techno capital will collapse, either reality imposes a set of constraints on any future reterritorialization that if your account or model doesn't take account of, will not succeed. And so that's what I'm getting at.
Yep. And I think that's a totally fair point. You know, the water, that you're not immune from the poison that's in the water that you swim in, I guess is the point there. You can't, if you are swimming in water that's full of lead, lead leads to all sorts of neurological problems, right? So that decreases the span of possibilities that you as an organism, are capable of doing, right? And that this is like the Deleuzian highest order way of looking at that. It's like it does restrict the possibilities if you literally have lead poisoning and turn into like a retard. Like you can do very little from there. But I just like my point being in all this and all this highfalutin is like the potentials are infinite. It doesn't matter if it's like you in like 10 dudes like actually rent like a commercial property, and you guys like reinstitute any problem that you want to tackle, whether it's like community, family rearing, or like enterprise, as in quote unquote returning to the style of enterprise that was more common with like trades being passed down from father to son. Maybe you could start that as a group of dudes. The amount of constriction of total possibilities, I think, is like I think you may be over emphasizing that. Yeah, overemphasizing how much restriction we have. We still have a lot of options open, so we should be hopeful.
Right. So to wrap this up, I think what we need is we need Lethem Paler to have one of his little AI art things where it says touching grass is the first step to reterritorialization.
Oh shit! I'm gonna shoot. I'm gonna shoot him a DM right after this stream.
All right. Okay. So that wasn't my final thought. What are your final thoughts first?
My final thoughts are that deterritorialization, is this interesting mode of flux. You can universally apply it to a bunch of different like real world things that are happening, whether it's geopolitics, all the way down to like your hand reaching out to grasp a hammer. Right? It's an interesting heuristic. I think it's a novel heuristic for thinking about like what is actually happening in a state of change as things change, right? And the point of Baudrillard is that we actually have like infinite change and infinite reversibility. Like a lot of his theory of like how exchange works in the modern world is actually the goal is a infinite reversibility, infinite exchange. And so the way that if that is increasing at an increasing rate, it's going exponential. I think it's important for people to internalize, this heuristic to actually think about like what is the dynamics of change.
Right. So I'll just say the final thought for me is how do we find a new political which is outside of the scope of the reigning hegemony? That I think is the real question that us dissidents have to grapple with. So go ahead.
Oh no, I was just gonna say like you have to. For me, my thinking is that you have to pick a particular dimension that you want to instigate the deterritorialization in order for you to choose option A or option B, reterritorialization. Like I think you have to be very precise with what you are attacking that is regime territory is I think how I'm thinking about it.
Sure. So before we wrap this all up, we have one super sticker from Chase for $10.
Hey, my boy.
Thank you, Chase. So where can people find you, Mike of Pol, and your work?
Yeah, so I have a Substack. It's covered in cobwebs. I'm actually writing my second article on Substack. That's Mike of Pol, or MikeOfPol.substack.com. You can find me on Twitter, of course, at Mike of Pol, where shit posting, put up some music stuff, various have fun, ecstasy of communication type things. It's the digital realm. We're on the Wired, and then you can also find me on Odyssey, if it continues to exist. Odyssey is up in the air ever since the SEC thing, but I'm hoping that whoever comes to own it next does not insta-ban me. But you can find me on Odyssey at Michelangelo of Pol.
All right. Thank you, Mike. It's always a pleasure.
Oh, it's always great. Thank you so much for having me on.
This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Fight podcast, signing off.